Professor Butler, thank you so much for being here with us. It's a real honor to have the opportunity to speak with you just before your talk on your new book, Who is Afraid of Gender? A timely intervention into the global reactionary term that targets gender directly. Let us begin our discussion precisely with this topic. In your book, you describe how anti-gender ideology constructs the phantasm of gender, turning the concept into a scapegoat, a process that you describe as a psychosocial phenomenon. In the current political context, marked by the rise of the far right, how does this anti-gender strategy intersect with authoritarianism and neoliberal policies?
Well, thank you for your question. I'm also very pleased to be here, and I appreciate the invitation to be in conversation with you. It's true that in the book, I suggest that gender is a kind of scapegoat. But when we say scapegoat, we usually mean that's not really the issue, that there are other issues that are more important, but that gender is covering over or concealing those other issues. I guess I would say, look, it is about gender, for sure. And it is about all the anxieties some people have, about what the future organization of society will be. The changes in gendered life, the fact that some people don't stay with the sex assignment given at birth, or the struggle for equality or freedom now includes women, which includes trans women, and men, including trans men. It includes people outside of the binary. It includes people who may be heterosexual or gay, lesbian, bisexual, asexual. I mean, there are so many ways of living life, and the traditional family is, of course, still with us, and that's not a problem in my view. But there are also many forms of kinship and intimate association that have changed. You can live with people with whom you're not sexually involved. You can be sexually involved with people you would never live with. We make our homes, we make our worlds in different ways. For some people, that's enormously frightening, destabilizing, because they think that their traditional way of understanding should be the way that everybody understands these matters. But in fact, we have become historically complex in relation to gender and sexuality. I think we have always been historically complex in relation to gender and sexuality. It's a site of vulnerability, of fear, anxiety, desire, passion. It's very intimate, this question of gender. So when people hate gender, or they hate trans people, or they hate gender studies as a field or public policy that is focusing on gender equality, freedom, anti-violence, anti-discrimination, they feel it as something very personal, as if their own way of life is being attacked or challenged or possibly even destroyed. So we need to take seriously the social dimensions. As we know, neoliberalism has been very successful in destroying what we can call public goods or social goods, the systems that guarantee housing or healthcare or education in most social democracies. Those systems have been privatized, they've been outsourced. Now they are a chance for entrepreneurs and private equity to gain a profit. So they invest in these issues and then they abandon them, which means that our basic needs in life, to be fed, to be housed, to have medical care and education, all of these depend now on financial forces rather than guarantees of government. But all those guarantees have been broken by neoliberalism. So many people are feeling, indeed, they don't know if they can own a home, stay in their apartment, make the rent, pay their debt. There's already enormous economic anxiety, climate catastrophe, enormous anxiety, open-ended wars, genocides that the United States and the European Union all sort of accept. What kind of world is this, you know? So I think there are many reasons why people are living with anxieties, and if the right wing comes along and says it's gender, or it's migrants, or it's trans people in particular, that's a very easy solution, and they come to represent and embody all those anxieties. And the right wing can capitalize on this consolidation of anxiety around issues of gender or race or migrant lives. It can capitalize precisely on that and say, the more power you give to the state, the more easily we can fix this. We can get rid of their rights. We can return you to a day in which the traditional family was the only definition of family, where sex was binary and people stayed with their primary sex assignment and treated that primary assignment as if it were permanent. And we can stay with white supremacy and patriarchy. We can return, in fact, to the days before all these social movements existed. So, you know, those are passionate appeals. We will get rid of your anxiety. We will restore order. We will fulfill your fantasy to go back to an earlier day in which your privilege was secure. Sounds like a good deal if you're a right-wing person.
The recent decision by the UK Supreme Court, according to which trans women do not meet the legal definition of woman, can be approached as a kind of enclosure of the social category woman based on anatomical characteristic and reproductive capacity, and which are the consequences?
I laugh because I'm really angry, but I don't want to be consumed by my anger, so I have to find some comedy in this. I mean, it's a comedy, it's a dark comedy, it's a terrible comedy, okay? And the reason why is the UK says the law will decide sex, right? Donald Trump says we will restore the biological truth of sex to the government, which means the government decides the biological truth. Now, if it's the legal system in the UK and it's the executive power in the US, that means that the state is going to decide it. Will the state consult with the biological sciences or the current scholarship in developmental biology? No. And it can't, it won't consult with science, even though it says it's defending science. It cannot consult developmental biology because developmental biology shows us that testosterone levels are a spectrum between men and women assigned at birth, and that it's not binary. It's not simply binary. You have more testosterone in some women than you have in some men, both of whom are assigned female and male at birth. It's why the sports committees have to regulate hormones. They have people taking more and taking less in order to conform with their policy definition of what is a woman and what is a man. So you have to suppress the actual complexity of masculine and feminine developmental sex formations in order to comply with the binary. And it's political. The state will decide that it's binary. The law will decide it's binary. The problem, of course, besides that, is that when we emerge biologically as female or male, and the minute we emerge as female or male, we're within a social category. But when we emerge and there is biological development, it only happens when chromosomes actually interact with the environment. So it's the state and the legal system in the US, in the UK, that are deciding that it is mandatory for sex to be binary and that sex is immutable and it's given at birth. They say they're doing this in the name of biological sciences. These are biological facts. And they accuse trans people and gender theory of ignoring biology. But that's actually not true. If you look at chromosomes and hormones, you will see there's complexity at that level. But also, within developmental biology, there are at least 16 paradigms for determining sex at birth, which I find very interesting. So the scientists are arguing among themselves, and the scientists also, at least in developmental biology, have made clear that you're not genetically determined because your genes are only activated through an interaction with the environment. So from the beginning, we are a mix of environment, chromosomes, and they act together in ways that are not deterministic. In other words, it is to a certain degree unpredictable how that combination will work in you. And that's another way of saying how you will live as a man, how you will live as a woman, how you will live between those categories as a combination or outside of them altogether. That changes with life and with interaction. And we're always interactive in these matters of sex. You know, the law says sex is immutable. It cannot change. Okay. But the law can change. Law is not immutable unless it claims to be natural law or it has an authoritarian power behind it. But we can take down that law. We can contest that law. We can disobey that law. So trans people are not nullified. They still exist, and they are reconstituting themselves outside the law in a collective freedom that is pathologized or criminalized in these new contexts. But that's the makings of a stronger political social movement, one that may well end up successfully contesting these vicious laws.
And how do you explain the fact that a part of the feminist movement rejects what you described in your book as the historically involving context of gender categories and instead turns to a position of biological determinism and also against trans and intersex people?
Well, it's breathtaking. It's shocking. It's sad. And it's enraging. Because none of those feminists want to be a woman according to a 19th century definition. They fought the 19th century definitions. They fought the definitions from the 1920s. They fought the definitions in the 1950s. They fought what the gynecologists said about who they are. They fought religious authorities that said you have to stay in the home. They changed the very meaning of what it is to be a woman, right? It's unbelievable. Women now in public space, in science, in media, in every possible field. And when they enter those fields, they also change what it means to be a woman, because now it's very possible. You could be a woman and a scientist. You can be a woman and a prime minister. You can be a woman and an astronaut. These are massive changes, historical changes in the definition of womanhood. And we needed that, and we fought for it. And the history of feminism is a history of contesting restrictive notions of gender. And when people told us, oh, you are biologically determined, you have to reproduce, that's your biological destiny. And we said, no, some of us want to, it's beautiful. Some of us don't want to, we shouldn't have to. When we insisted on that, we insisted that biology is not destiny. So for these so-called feminists, I don't think of them really as feminists. I think of them as authoritarians. These so-called feminists want to return us to a biological definition. Well, they show disdain for the biological sciences, which are important as a field and complex. But they also are undermining the very accomplishments of feminism. We keep that category open. No, but let's say a woman cannot give birth. It's not possible. She's not fertile. Is she any less of a woman because she cannot give birth? I think we say No, she's equally a woman. We don't say you're less of a woman than someone who's giving birth. No, we don't say that. We fought against that. Feminists, we fought. We said, do not define us by our reproductive capacity because some women do not have it. Do we say that an older woman who loses her reproductive capacity is no longer a woman? No, we don't do that. Right? That's cruel. It's horrible. If we say, oh, somebody who chooses not to give birth because they're thriving in other ways in their lives, do we say, oh, too bad, you're less of a woman? No. We say you're free and equal and also a woman, and we've expanded our category. So if a trans man gives birth, that doesn't make him a woman. He has a reproductive capacity. Okay? That doesn't hurt anybody who's assigned female at birth and stays female and gives birth. That person still gives birth. That person gives birth. It hurts no one. It's just part of the complexity of our social world. We can choose to deny that complexity or to criminalize complexity. But if we start to criminalize human complexity, then we're as bad as any orthodox religion or any unthinking authoritarian.
Building alliances across diverse struggles has long been a key challenge for progressive politics. In political theory, several concepts have been proposed, from the chain of equivalence and the populist strategy of Ernesto Laclau to the multitude of hard and angry, the logic of horizontal networks inspired by Deleuze. What is your perspective? How can we strike a balance between conflicting demands in order to form a broader progressive alliance?
Well, I think that I do, to some extent, follow the argument of Ernesto Laclau and Chantal Mouffe. And I add Mouffe because for her, what appears at first to be an irresolvable conflict can become an important kind of antagonism, even an agonism, that allows us to understand each other, even if we don't agree. And the reason we can stay in alliance, even when we're not agreeing on all things, is that we do agree on some fundamental things, like the fight against fascism, or the fight against authoritarianism, or the pursuit of radical democracy. And if we remember who is our enemy, then our differences, we can live with them, we can work on them, make them productive conflicts. But I don't think striking a balance between conflicting views is right. I don't want a balance, because then we're just chopping off parts of the left or the progressive movement. You know, if people say, oh, the trans issue, it causes too many problems, we should get rid of that. Or the migrants, we don't need to defend migrant rights. It's causing too much problem. We need to become more popular. So the migrants get abandoned, the trans people get abandoned, and you're striking a balance so that you bring a stronger consensus. That is not right. What Laclau and Mouffe actually taught us is that you take every conflict like that as a chance or an opportunity to expand your alliance. So I think we have to quit fighting only each other, right? The anti-trans feminists imagine that trans people are the problem. The problem is fascism. The problem is authoritarianism, is increasing state powers and enormous violence, both by violent means, explicit military means, by the law, by the police, by the military, but also violence by negligence and abandonment. We need to keep that in mind as what we are trying to fight. We want radical equality. We want a socialism that is linked to a fundamentally democratic project. We want to save the earth or find a way to regenerate it. I mean, within that context, yes, we are going to have struggles.
Okay. In recent years, as you mentioned already, we have witnessed the global rise of far-right movements. How do you explain the appeal of figures like Donald Trump and the broader far-right trend among voters who traditionally might not align with such ideologies. And I'm thinking here specifically people from immigrant backgrounds, economically marginalized groups, women, or even LGBTQ people. What socio-political or affective even mechanism do you think that is at play that secures this cross-demographic support towards the far-right?
Well, I'm not sure how large the cross-demographic support is. We can point to, in the United States, certain minorities having voted for Trump in greater numbers than earlier. Okay. He didn't increase his numbers among women very much. But you have to remember that the campaigns against the left or even the center left are campaigns in which they are blamed for all kinds of problems, insecurities. And the right has monopolized the media in such a way to produce these very compelling forms of hatred. And that's passionate. You know, hatred is a passion. And people feel, instead of hopeless or resigned, they feel excited. Now, excitement comes with fascism. They know how to generate excitement. How does the left generate excitement? Right? So that's our question. How do we make the love of democracy exciting? How do we make radical equality exciting? And in a way, you have to ask people what kind of world they want to live in. Like, where the earth is destroyed or where the earth is repaired. Where some people have no health care and others do. Well, if you're full of hatred and resentment, you say, I don't care about those people. But what would it mean to care or to develop a deep sense that we have the power to live equally and freely and dismantle the most violent and economically unjust structures in this world? But we can't be moralistic about it in the way that the left sometimes is. If we have an ethical vision, it has to become passionate. It has to become beautiful. We have to become objects of desire. And we don't think that. We fight, we criticize, we know what's wrong, but what is right? And how do we put forth that? But those demographics, they are looking for vision, for passion, for a possibility of living and thriving. So what do we have that we want to offer them?
Since the early days of the new Trump administration, we've observed a coordinated effort to control American universities and an authoritarian attack on the critical and liberal values of academia. Why have they become such a central target of these attacks, and how safe is the academic environment for feminist queers and activists?
Oh my goodness. There's several issues that are now associated with academic life. I mean, they're the explicit ones, like support for Palestine among the student body, among the faculty, courses and fields that re-narrate the history of the Middle East so that we do not accept the proposition that Israel is always the beacon of democracy, or whatever it does to defend itself is justified in light of the 20th century genocide against the Jewish people. It's a more complex history. So the interest in Palestine as an academic issue, the support for Palestine, not always the support for Hamas, by the way. You could be against the bombing of hospitals without supporting Hamas. You can be against the lack of citizenship for Palestinian people without supporting Hamas. I've always supported only nonviolent Palestinian movements. I'm in trouble on the left for this. But on the right, I am Hamas. So what do I do? But there is now, the Heritage Foundation in the U.S. has a plan for purifying academia of wokeism, of diversity, equity, and inclusion, which has sought to bring more racial, ethnic minorities into academic life. The criticism of Israel, or the opening up of the very topic of Israel-Palestine in new ways, is also considered now in many places, not all places, to be anti-Semitic or hate speech. So there are some universities that have called in the police to censor and even to violently attack their own students. There are some universities that have given the names of protesting students to the government to arrest them, detain them, or deport them, especially if they are international students who are the most vulnerable. But there are other universities that have said, no, we are not doing that. You cannot get lists. You are not invited on campus. We defend the right of protest. We defend the right of assembly. So we're seeing a shift right now where more university presidents and more universities are trying to defend their students. And of course, the Trump administration is threatening to cancel all federal loans which support scientific research more than the humanities and the arts. But some of those places are saying, okay, we lose that money. Otherwise, we are owned and manipulated by the government and we become instruments of censorship. So on campus, we are safe to some degree. With our own communities, we are safe to some degree. There are great solidarity networks. There's a beautiful sanctuary network, especially for international students and for migrants and for those who are most vulnerable to detention and deportation. We have many lawyers working pro bono without being paid, helping students and helping scholars, helping artists, media figures to retain their rights of free speech. But we are learning to organize in a new way. We thought we could rely on our constitutional freedoms, but we cannot. We have to fight for them. So it's a new day, but I see new developments that are more hopeful. The first 100 days were miserable, but we are getting smarter and our solidarity networks are getting stronger.
You have spoken out against the colonial and genocidal policies of the State of Israel in the Palestinian territories. How do you view the current views of the concert of anti-Semitism to deflect criticism against the war? And more particularly, do you think that the memory of the Holocaust is being instrumentalized by Netanyahu regime in order to justify the ongoing genocide in Palestine?
I think we have to begin by making a distinction. There is anti-Semitism. I am Jewish. I encounter anti-Semitism. Somebody put on Facebook that Judith Butler is super rich. Now, I'm not super rich. I'm comfortable, okay? I'm not poor. But why did they say you're super rich? And I thought, it's anti-Semitism. Right? It just felt it to me. Or when I was in Brazil, they had this puppet they made of me with horns. Right? Why did I have horns? There's anti-Semitism on the left. If we say, oh, all Jews support Israel, that's false. And that's making the Jewish people into a monolith. The debates about Israel have been part of Jewish life since the 1890s, if not before. All of the world congresses on Zionism, the World Jewish Congresses, where Zionism was debated, were mid-1890s through 1948 and even after, involved Jewish people having different views on Zionism. So if somebody says to me, oh, all the Jews are Zionists, or to be anti-Zionist is to be anti-Semitic, these people don't know Jewish history, and they're not actually interested in Jewish history, or what those debates were. Oh, should we have a state? Some Jews said, no, we shouldn't have a state. Zionism is a cultural phenomenon. It's a phenomenon of Jewish revival. those people, when they said that in the 20s and 30s, were angry at the rabbis. They said, oh, let's get away from the rabbis. Let's have a living Judaism. The rabbis are making us learn the same thing again and again. It was an anti-rabbinic movement within Judaism, and Zionism was about cultural renewal. Now, you could want cultural renewal by establishing state primarily for the Jewish people, or you could say, no, the state structure will poison our spiritual values. And many people came up with that. And even in 1945, 6, 7, and 8, big debates. Do we make a single state with the Palestinians who are already on the land? Many Jews were Zionists who were in favor of that one-state solution, binational state. That was a legitimate Jewish position. It was a legitimate Zionist position. And now we only ask one leg. Do you defend Netanyahu? Do you defend the right of Israel to exist? Now, of course, I'm not going to say Israel has no right to exist, but my question is, well, for the future, what if Israel exists in a constitutional state where everyone on the land who lives there and those who have been forced off have equal rights and live under a constitution that guarantees equal rights? I sound like a silly American. I sound like a classical liberal. But if I say that, I no longer hold a Zionist position because that has been eliminated from the history of Zionism. And I am considered a terrorist, even though I'm asking for constitutional law forged through deliberation, nonviolent means, through participatory democracy, right? There's no destruction of the state of Israel in a violent way. I'm opposed to that. But the problem is that if you say, hey, going forward, maybe there would be more peace if everybody had equal rights, and you call it the Palestinian territories. Well, the territory of Israel. Right? No citizenship. No, some elections that are overseen by Israel. No right over the border. No right to travel without authorization from the Israeli government. Living in low salaries and limited mobility, and incredibly vulnerable to constant arrest and detention with no rights of due process. Now, that has to change, otherwise we will always have uprisings because nobody wants to live in unfreedom like that. But it's not anti-Semitic to want to live in freedom. In fact, many people who have gone through the Holocaust, many of my closest friends who are older than me, who were, in fact, in camps, and those of us who come from families who suffered hideous losses under the Nazi regime, we want everyone to live in freedom. We want no one to be detained. That's the lesson that we brought forward, not military state power that suppresses another people or forcibly deports them as we were forcibly deported. No. I didn't like the fact that my family had to flee Europe. And what does it mean that they now are constantly deporting people and saying they must flee, must flee? So, yes, there is an instrumentalization of anti-Semitism, but there's also anti-Semitism. And if we want to include that among the racisms we oppose, we need to know what it is and what it is not. But to have a principled objection to violence, to have a principled position in favor of equality, freedom, and justice, that's not anti-Semitism. That's part of the values that the Jewish people have developed, and Jewish ethical justice, Jewish social justice is an affirmation of those principles, coming right out of the Holocaust, coming right out of the genocide. Never again that kind of killing, murder, detention, deportation, never again. So we need to be clear about what is and is not anti-Semitism. And look, when and if those in the Palestinian movement, the Palestinian liberation movement, say anti-Semitic things about Jews, we object. We object. fight the Israeli state. Fight Israel, but Israel is not the Jews. The Jews have always debated about Israel. And even though Netanyahu says, we are all of the Jews, we represent all of the Jews, if you fight us, you're fighting the Jews. No. We say no. That is not the case. You do not represent us, and you never will. So that fight is alive, especially among progressive Jews. And that's what we need to understand, so that we allow the Jewish people to be complex, historical, internally conflictual, and we know what it is when anti-Semitism happens, so we can oppose it. But if we cheapen the charge of anti-Semitism, and everybody we disagree with becomes anti-Semitic, then we can't use it anymore, and real anti-Semitism goes unchallenged. So we need to preserve the integrity of the allegation of anti-Semitism as we do every form of racism, including anti-Palestinian racism. We have to preserve the integrity of those allegations. But when they are weaponized, we don't believe in them anymore, right? We have no way to fight anti-Semitism when it is weaponized.
So one last question. Many people who feel solidarity with Palestinians also experience a sense of helplessness, that a feeling that they cannot do anything to stop genocide. A similar sense of futility is often felt in the face of authoritarian regimes and neoliberal hegemony. The belief that political and economical elites are stronger than the societies constitutes a clear victory for the dominant system of power. Can we deal with this sense of futility without falling into passivity? Are there forms of resistance today that generate hope and motivation?
Yes, there are many forms of resistance, and in so many countries there are demonstrations every Saturday. And the people in Gaza in particular, they know when there are demonstrations. They get the word and they thank us. They thank us for showing up, because most of the major states have failed to challenge the genocidal acts of the state of Israel, and yet there's popular support, and at some point that popular support is going to start affecting the ability of states or parties in particular to stay in power. So look, education is something you can do. Showing films is something you can do. Doing online education in Gaza, following the prisoner advocacy networks, establishing contacts with people at Birzeit University, or contacts with filmmakers and artists from Palestine, and bringing them in to make us more educated and more aware of what the situation is. But it seems to me that this kind of futility, this deep pessimism, it comes from the idea that everything that needs to be changed will be changed at once or not at all. But this change, we've already changed consciousness. We've already changed an awareness of what's happening in Palestine and how long the Palestinians have been living under situations like this. I mean, this genocide is in some ways absolutely unprecedented, but it is continuous with the destruction of villages in 1948 and the indefinite detention of Palestinians in the West Bank and Gaza, and the forcible displacement and the land appropriation that has been happening since 48. So learning that history, communicating it. I mean, I know medical professionals who get online, they get on Zoom in the morning to help decide what kind of care somebody needs. I know 2 doctors who do that. They offer their medical services online. Small things like that. I edit editorials for Jewish Voice for Peace. I do it every day. So I don't have futility because I'm always doing, right? So find that thing you can always do that keeps you involved, connected, and just making whatever difference is possible. And there's hope that gets regenerated through that, but also forms of solidarity that are often unexpected, surprising, and hugely important.